Hi, everyone. Uh, my name is Kevin Chong. I'm an associate professor here in creative studies. I'd first like to welcome you all to I guess it's the 5th annual Sharon Thesen Lecture. I'd also like to acknowledge that the University of British Columbia, Okanagan sits on land that is the unceded territory of the Silks peoples. I'm really excited to hear Anne's talk. But before we do that, I would like to talk a little about the series and introduce our namesake.
Yay!
Yeah, yay! Sharon Thesen is a renowned Canadian poet, writer, editor, and critic who lives in Lake Country. She has written 11 monographs and chapbooks, including The Good Bacteria, Uyama Pink Shale, and The Receiver, all of which are featured in this eclectic exhibition here today. In addition to her writing, she has edited 2 editions of the New Long Poem Anthology, 2 editions of Charles Olson's correspondence with book designer Francis Boldereff, and a Governor General's Award-winning selection of poems by Phyllis Webb, The Vision Tree. Her most recent publication is Refabulations, which collects and reanimates the longer poems from Thesen's body of work, ranging from her first book published in 1980 to the present. Sharon is Professor Emerita of Creative Writing at UBC's Okanagan campus. The Creative Writing program at UBC intends for the Sharon Thesen Lecture to acknowledge her contributions to British Columbia, Canadian literature, and to the Creative Writing program at UBCO. In her honor, a different writer each year will give a lecture that tackles key issues, contemporary writing, poetics, and Canadian literature. By recording each lecture, we will create a wonderful resource of contemporary thinking by writers. So far, we've had John Lent, who gave the very first Sharon Thesen lecture. I gave one during Zoom times in 2021, followed by Matt Rader, followed by Nancy Holmes, and now we have Anne Fleming. I'd like to welcome Sharon to the front to say some words about the talk we're going to hear from Anne.
Thank you, Kevin. I'm really grateful for this incredible honor of an annual lecture being given in my name by an esteemed writer, former colleague or guest. Last year's lecture was given by Nancy Holmes, the previous by Matt Rader. And Kevin has given a lecture and someone, and Nat. Yeah. And it's so fitting that Anne should be citing Keats's wonderful epigram about truth and beauty, which really is an adage anybody can live by, especially when added to his saying that he was certain of nothing except the holiness of the heart's affections and the truth of the imagination. Anne is truly a writer of great heart and skill. And I hope she ends up winning the Giller Prize. Someone else said, art is the only twin life has, its only valid metaphysic. As readers, we are happy to be happy. As readers and writers, we're happy to be happy, ecstatic nobodies in the presence of art's sustaining beauty. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you also to the UBC Library for including a portion, largely vintage, of my poetry library in its special collections. It's an honor as well to be in the presence of friends, colleagues, and admired writers from our world. Thanks.
So I'd like to introduce Anne, and following Anne's talk, I'd also like to have a Q&A, and that's my prompt for you to think of brilliant and insightful questions to ask Anne, which you will answer with equal insight. Anne Fleming is a professor of queer writing in the Department of Creative Studies at UBCO. She has written 5 books of fiction and poetry, most recently Curiosities, longlisted for the 2024 Giller Prize. Her prior publications include The Goat, a book for children and poems. What's spelled with a W? I don't know how to say that. I forget. Like at some point you have to say that. A work of poetry shortlisted for the BC Book Prize's Dorothy Livesay Poetry Prize. Gay Dwarves of America, which featured multiple stories that were recognized variously by the National Magazine Awards, the Journey Prize, and the Ethel Wilson Prize. Anne has contributed to a number of LGBTQ anthologies, including Persistence, Always, Butch and Femme, and Queers Were Here, Heroes and Icons of Queer Canada. Anne is a past member of the jury member of the Dane Ogilvie Prize, a literary award for LGBT writers in Canada. On her lecture, Truth, Beauty, Anne writes, when Sharon Thesen gives a talk or a reading, I always feel as if I could listen to her all day long. She has this deep knowledge of poetry and writing, combined with her own deep thinking that is revelatory. Plus, she's irreverent, funny, and down to earth. The Sharon Thesen Lecture is an opportunity to tackle the persistent big questions about writing. What it's for, why do we do it, what do we love about it? The big questions preoccupying me right now are, how is fiction true, and why does beauty matter? Which also means, what is beauty? If I come close to emulating Sharon in this year's lecture, I'll be happy. Please welcome Anne.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Sharon. And thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to the people who are joining us online. I'm really tickled to be here, and I hope I can live up to what I said I was going to do. Because, well, that is always a question, isn't it? Yeah, I wanted to start with a thank you, and also a thank you. I'm grateful to be on this land in this territory of the Sioux people, whose Okanagan Nation Declaration says, we are the unconquered Aboriginal people of this land, our mother. The Creator has given us our mother to enjoy, to manage, and to protect. We, the first inhabitants, have lived with our mother from time immemorial. Our Okanagan governments have allowed us to share equally in the resources of our mother. We have never given up our rights to our mother's resources, our governments, and our religion. We will survive and continue to govern our mother and her resources for the good of all, for all time. Thank you to the Okanagan people for their declaration, their laws, and their care of the land. Also want to thank the people who organized this event. Vanessa Costa de Silveira, Sean Odlifson, Paige Homan, Daniel Tomlinson, and Matt Rader, and maybe there are other people too, but there's a lot of behind the scenes work that goes into making this happen, and I really appreciate the work of everyone who is involved. I'm going to start by reading just one stanza of a Sharon Thesen poem. It's called Joie de Vivre, and it goes like this. A removable red shoulder pad and a paperback dictionary side by side on the desk signify the woman writer's desire for an exactitude of appearance and expression, the long incisive points of her downstrokes, the abrupt beginnings and closed O's of her written word, suggesting secrecy, agitation, impatience. No more will she try to disguise her preoccupations with beauty and truth, or conceal her desire to make lots of dollar signs, emulate Colette in her late age, dispensing treatments and advice, and still writing, still getting married. That's from her book, The Beginning of the Long Dash, from 1987, whose title I just like saying over and over because I can just hear that CBC voice. No more will she try to disguise her preoccupations with beauty and truth. They are perennial, aren't they? Those preoccupations. They're what I'm talking about today because the place I was in when I had to come up with a title for this talk, the place I'm still in, is a place between two books, two novels. Curiosities, which was published in April, and which I'm beginning to take to fall writers' festivals in Canada, and a new novel about Florence Weil and Frances Lauren, two sculptors born in the 1880s, often known as the Girls, who lived and worked together for more than 60 years, most of them in a converted church in Toronto. The premise of Curiosities is that an amateur historian named Anne Fleming, hapless though she is, keeps discovering these 17th century manuscripts, 5 of them in all, that seem separate but end up being interconnected. One of them about the fate of a girl orphaned by plague whose father dug his own grave. One a tale of a noblewoman who wants to vindicate her beloved of a charge of witchcraft. One a confession of a witch hunter. One a long letter explaining a misunderstanding. And one a series of letters from a voyage to Hudson Bay. It's happened quite a lot that people who have read the book come up to me and ask, okay, I have to know how much of the book is true. I kept like Googling things and I still can't tell. And in fact, the jacket flap copy for Curiosities says it falls upon Anne, reading between faded pages and centuries, to uncover the fate of the lovers and to add her own contemporary line of truth to this tale from a time when there were no labels for who Tom and Joan might be. Already the idea of truth is made both important and suspect by those quotation marks. I'm also really grappling with truth in the next book, which I don't have a title for yet. Specifically, the truth about the question whether Loring and Weil were lesbians, were lovers. The first biography of them was written in 1972, they died in 68, so just a few years after their death. And there's a big emphasis in that on Florence's the story that she had an affair with her male sculpting teacher at the Art Institute of Chicago in the early 1900s. And then that Frances's father, she had a German lover, but her father was like, this is around the time of the First World War, and her father's like, you cannot have a German lover, he has to be banished. And they kind of played up these stories, and the biography really plays up these stories. It also mentions that the pair lost possible apprenticeship positions in Greenwich Village in New York in 1910 because of a rumor that they were lesbians. But the biography really brusquely denies the possibility that this could be true in any way, which in 1972, that's not really that surprising. Elspeth Cameron's biography was published in 2007, and it also reports, so she talks to all the people who are still alive who knew Loring and Weil personally. And she asks all of them directly, do you think they were lesbians? And all of them say, no, absolutely not. And she's kind of like, oh. So she reports that very faithfully, but then she also allows the possibility that that could all be a fiction. We don't know. When you see photos of them, I have to say, they sure look like lesbians to me. Florence in her gray flannel skirts and short hair and tie, she has hair very much like this in like 1965, is pretty butch. And the way Frances says, Florence, come over here and sit down. And a 1965 CBC television feature on them sounds like a person talking to her spouse. When I showed that clip, that 1965 documentary, to a queer painter friend of mine, she was like, oh, there is nobody straight here. This is actually my second run at writing something about Loring and Weil. In the early 90s, I started to write a play about them. I first heard about them in 1987 when I worked in Toronto. I lived in Kensington Market and worked on University Ave. And so I walked down Dundas Street every day on my way to work past the art gallery. And there was an exhibition called Sculptor's Legacy that featured Loring and Weil, a retrospective of them. And I went in and I saw the sculpture is really beautiful. It's gorgeous. There's a big range of like little wooden figurines, like these gorgeous naked torsos. There's one called Sun Worshipper, and she's got like a naked torso. She's like this. And there's also like this giant 8-foot hockey goalie. So I was taken with the sculpture itself, but always I was just really taken with the story of the two of them. They met in 1905 at the Art Institute of Chicago, where they were both students. Florence had already started teaching there a little bit as well, and became friends really quickly. In 1910, they moved to Greenwich Village. and had a studio in above a stables and in McDougal Alley, right at kind of the hotbed of bohemian Greenwich Village of anarchy and feminism in 1910. They were there till about 1912, when in some ruse, Francis's father, when they were both out of town, he swooped in and shut down their studio and like put all of their artwork into storage, which seems really suspicious. Like a dad saying, "Oh, the Lesbos cannot have their studio here." And in 1913, they moved to Toronto. They had a studio on Church Street above a carpentry shop. And then in 1920, they moved to a decommissioned church building near St. Clair and Mount Pleasant, which was at the time really on the outskirts of the city. And they stayed there until their deaths until 1967. They both went into the same nursing home, sadly on separate floors, and they were never allowed to see each other in that final year of their lives. They died within 3 weeks of each other in 1968. So when I heard all those details of their lives, I was just captivated. I felt like, I really want to find out more about them. I really want to write this play, I thought. And so I was doing my MFA at UBC Vancouver, and I was taking a playwriting class. I'm like, okay, I'm going to write this play. And I started to write the play, and it was painful. I got about, I don't know, 5 scenes written, and I just felt like I was dragging lower and lower. And what was going on? I'm skipping, but that's okay. The pain was that I had this feeling that I couldn't shake, and it was that I didn't know them. I read the second biography wasn't out, but I read the first one. I'd read all this background material. I'd done a lot of research. I didn't know them. I would never know them. And so I felt like I couldn't tell the truth about them. And so I couldn't write about them at all. And even I still felt like this is a paradox and a weird kind of thing, because it's like, I knew intellectually that writers fictionalize real people all the time. Like Tolstoy's Napoleon is not Napoleon. And, Shana Lambert's Petra is not the leader of the Green Party. And Wayne Johnson's Joey Smallwood is not Joey Smallwood. It's like, writers do this all the time. It's not hard, but I found it impossible. I got completely stumped. And I don't know, why couldn't I get over it? I don't know. I just couldn't. But why am I trying again now? I don't know. I just am. I'm just going to see of the things that I skipped, what is important that I missed. Okay, the only thing it's not important at all, but I just want to say it anyway, is it was just a bit about how, in 1972, it's not a weird story that like they're just good friends who live together. It's not weird that there would be those denials of their couplehood. Just in the way that the 2 women who lived down the street from me that we called the dog ladies. They had 3 golden retrievers. They were both teachers at Havergal College in Toronto. And we're like, of course, they're just the dog ladies, they're just not 2 nice women who live together. And the 2 nice men to whose house I delivered the newspaper were just, lonely bachelors who ease their loneliness by living together. So yeah, okay, all right. I wasn't one of those people who knew at age 8 that they wanted to be a writer. Reading was central to me and felt necessary. I found books so satisfying and devastating that they felt ordained rather than made. When I thought about their authors, it was with a sense that they were magical geniuses. And what they did was like so far from what I might do, like what didn't even cross my mind that this might be something that I could do. It was still off the table when, as an undergrad, I joked that I wanted to read for a living. Really, I was like, I just want to read for a living. And but when I did begin to write, I wrote jokes. I wrote dumb rhyming poems whose bad rhymes were the jokes. I wrote absurd plotless stories about amoebas. And then I wrote a fairly earnest column for the university newspaper called Feminism 101. And then poems that still included jokes, but didn't rhyme. and were about things that I noticed, traffic, neighbors, and pumpkins in a field. I wanted to write fiction, but when I tried to write any fiction other than parody, I was absolutely paralyzed by possibility. If I could make anything happen, which as a writer of fiction, you totally can, how could I possibly decide what to make happen? This, it turns out, is the main thing that I had to learn about writing fiction. Not how to write a sentence or a scene or a character, but how to decide what to write, what to make happen. I'd also somehow imbibed the notion that fiction had to be entirely made up. Like if you drew from life, you were cheating. Elif Batuman is a Turkish-American writer whom I really admire, and she alludes to this in an interview. She's famous for writing what's come to be called autofiction, though at the time she was writing her first book, The Idiot, the term wasn't so much in use. And she says, I think there's a massive cover-up about the extent to which all literature draws from the author's personal experience. I think that there's a tendency, especially in the US, to overvalue the extent to which writing a novel is an act of creative imagination. That inspiration comes to you from the sky and it has nothing to do with anything. And if you're truly original, then it doesn't have to do with your life. It doesn't have to do with what you read. And I think that's bogus. Literature arose by pulling things from life. It's a way of telling stories about the things that happen to us and the things that we read and the interactions that we have. And they're all in conversation with each other. For some reason, that made me think of Thomas King's book, The Truth About Stories, his Massey lecture series, and the refrain that he says over and over, which is, the truth about stories is that that's all we are. What I started to figure out little by little as I wrote more and more fiction was that my guide was truth. My guide was observation. What have I observed to be true? The large and the small. Write that. The small might be the way a teenage boy who's grown muscles over the summer can't help touching those muscles over and over again, or the way that people show their tongue when they're concentrating. The large might be the ways that people rationalize their own behavior, especially their bad behavior or their selfishness. But if all fiction addresses or tries to get at human truths, well, maybe not all fiction. I think that a lot of genre fiction cares less about truth than about offering a thrill or sensation. But if most fiction tries to get at human truths, none of it will get at all truths. It can't. Truths are different for different people. It's kind of obvious. The truth is that truth has always been a contested idea, says Salman Rushdie in a 2018 article in The New Yorker. Social movements of the 20th century revealed the incompleteness and untruth of 19th century realism, he says. And writers from Franz Kafka to Ralph Ellison and Gabriel Garcia Marquez created stranger and more surreal texts telling the truth by means of obvious untruth, creating a new kind of reality as if by magic. I've argued, he says, for much of my life as a writer, that the breakdown in the old agreements about reality is now the most significant reality, and that the world can perhaps be best explained in terms of conflicting and often incompatible narratives. He says more, but ultimately he comes to this. When we read a book we like or even love, we find ourselves in agreement with its portrait of human life. Yes, we say, this is how we are. This is what we do to one another. This is true. That perhaps is where literature can help most. We can make people agree in this time of radical disagreement on the truths of the great constant, which is human nature. I had a bunch of other things that I wanted to say in here, like how one set of writers will enact correctives to another set of writers. Like it seemed to me that George R.R. Martin in A Game of Thrones, when he's killing off main characters, he's like reacting to like that unspoken rule of earlier fantasy, which says you never kill off main characters. Like Gandalf dies, but no, he doesn't die. He comes back from the dead and he's even better, you know? But George R.R. Martin is just like, Ned's dead. And that's it. He doesn't come back from the dead. He's not better. I also wanted to talk about the ways in which tales or the fantastic or the fabulous can be true, or the ways in which exaggeration or hyperbole can relate truths. But I want to go back to curiosities for a minute. One of the truths that sparked the novel was the historical record of witch beliefs. which showed that witches were able to make a glamour, something called a glamour, which is where we get the word glamour from, and I love that it came from this. So like a shimmery kind of thing, a glamour. And they could use this glamour to obscure various things, but one of the things they could obscure with it was men's penises. Because you could also, a salve could also do the same thing. Some witches used salves to take a man's penis and then, but that wasn't just covering it up. That was like taking it. One witch said she took it and like threw it in the river. Okay, so that's one of the truths from the historical record. And then one true thing, one observed thing from my own life that fueled the writing of Curiosities was my lifelong experience of people gendering me, especially gendering me male in the face of contradictory indicators like the name Anne, or when I was 12 and I had shoulder length hair and earrings in both ears, or one time in my early 20s, I was buying cigarettes after I'd been at some family event. So I was wearing a skirt and I hadn't had time to take off the skirt yet. And I went into a convenience store and I'm wearing my skirt. Or of course, all the times that I've gone in, or many times I've gone in and out of women's washrooms. You'd think you're using a women's washroom, it's maybe a signal that that's the right one for you. But no, it was really amazing to watch. And at the same time, I don't want to fault people who did this because they weren't exactly wrong in gendering me male. Like, I want to be masculine. That's my goal. Like, I want to do that. So it's not like they're wrong. But it was really amazing to watch people visibly and verbally discount the evidence. They'd be like, oh, you've got really long hair for a boy. I've never met a boy wearing 2 earrings before. Anne, that's a funny name for a boy. Or hey, check it out, it's a guy in a skirt, and so on. Before they questioned their own assumptions. How far could this go? As a kid, I really did wonder how far I could take it. I regularly took a bag of clothes from home and then I would change, like in a park behind a bush. And sometimes I would introduce myself as Andy, but only when I knew that I wasn't going to come back to that place. Like I was never going to have to be accountable in any way. I wouldn't have to be Andy in an ongoing way. The other thing, oh yeah, the thing about that was I was afraid of discovery. I was afraid that what would happen, like this was another truth that I had seen, which is that some of the people who thought me male actually did sooner or later figure out that, that they did pick up on those other cues. And some of them were embarrassed and some were disgusted, some were apologetic, but a lot of them were angry. They were like really angry with me. Like I had done something to them, like I had tricked them and it was my fault and they were mad at me. And or just even that I caused them to feel embarrassment. They're like, some people get really pissed that you made them and they feel like, oh my God, I made a mistake. I'm embarrassed and I'm angry about it. And I've never been gender bashed, which is great. I've had men shout faggot out cars, but I've never been physically hurt, which is good. I shouldn't be, but I have felt the danger of it lurking. So anyway, I put this experience together of people believing in their unconscious and automatic gendering with reading that review that said witches could put a glamour over a man's penis to make it disappear. And it seemed obvious to me there was a story to be told about someone who'd never had a penis being thought bewitched rather than born without one. Okay, so the book is fueled or driven by this real thing, this observed thing, together with this historical thing. I've got this penisless man discovered naked and believed to be bewitched. How do I get him there? Where did he come from? What has to happen along each step along the way? What truths guide these choices? Again, I still feel like that, 20-year-old trying to write fiction for the first time going, oh my God, there's way too many choices. I don't know. What do I make happen? Which is, I think, one of the reasons that I write so slowly. I'm just like, oh, what true thing is going to guide this next thing that I'm working on? If the dictates of truth telling suggest that, given my fear of discovery, Tom, too, the character, the penisless man, would also have a fear of discovery, while the dictates of story would suggest that Tom has to be discovered, which in fact does happen. Like that's a premise that the book is all built around. But something in me resisted according the discovery storyline too much primacy. And this points to another aspect of truth and fiction that has always been in tension for me throughout my career, which is the difference between plot and real life. When we're teaching story to students, we do try to allow for non-traditional narrative. We do try to make room for experimental fiction or plotless fiction. We try to make room for as many kinds of fiction as we can, but we always still talk about beginning, middle, and end. We talk about causality. And it's funny because I got an email today from Cole Mash, who's a former student, who said, I'm sorry I can't make it tonight, but I'm thinking of you because I'm teaching beginning and middle and end right now. And I'm like, oh, that fits really well with my talk. Because it feels like, you know, it's not really a true it's a way to keep readers reading, but it's not a way to represent real life a lot of the time. And so it always feels like a tension to me. I still think that you can do things that are, you know, have that feel of real life and not plot and make it compelling and interesting. The criticism is sometimes that if you don't have the plot, it's not compelling and interesting. I think we can make that happen. One of my favorite books is, well, maybe not. Anyway, among my favorite books, which are many, is The Mezzanine by Nicholson Baker, in which a man goes for lunch. He literally, that's the whole story. And it's absolutely captivating. He like goes off on like the design of milk cartons, like how they fold it and the genius of that. And anyway, maybe it's not for everyone, but I love it. Right. So I'm at the point where I'm running out of time to say much more about truth, if I'm going to say anything about beauty. But there is one more thing that I want to say, which is, for all that I'm talking about truth, there's still a central aspect of fiction that is deeply false, which is that it gives us the illusion that we can know other people. We can know what it's like to be in someone else's mind. We can't. We never ever can. Never, not for sure. But I think that's one of the reasons that we like fiction, is that it gives us the illusion that we can. It's like one of those things, one of those illusions that I'm like happy to grant fiction. It's one of the reasons that I read. I think that's one of the drivers to write fiction, is that we can pretend that maybe we do know what other people think. Okay, beauty. I picked up on the Loring and Weil story again, partly because I never stopped being interested in them. As you can see when I was talking about them, like I hope it came across that I'm like, I just think they're fascinating. But also I was applying to do this writing residency in France, and I had to come up with a project. And the residency was started by the wife of an American sculptor who had this fancy place in France. And I'm like, oh, this is going to help me get a place. And maybe it did, but because I went and it was great. Actually, also like this American sculptor, he was also born in the 1880s, and also, you know, kind of, so they came of age at the same time. And they had the same notions about beauty, which is they were taught that Greek ideals of sculpture were it, like that was it, that was beauty, and they never really changed. Like they maintained that aesthetic throughout their lives, even through the rise of many other kinds of approaches to art. They were actually really supportive of other artists who didn't do what they did, but they felt like, you know, welding pieces of metal together is not art. So they were kind of old-fashioned that way. And I wondered if there might be something too old-fashioned about their notions of their own sexuality. That might be something to pick up on. But I started to realize as I began to work on like actually writing scenes, I'm writing scenes now, they're better. I'm not feeling that they're painful and I hate them. But I realized that like all this time I'm spending going like, weren't they, is feels like beside the point. Like, that reduces them to that one thing. Like, just stop. Don't do that. So then I started asking myself, okay, well, what did they care about? They cared about sculpture. They cared about beauty. They cared about their work. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to read about beauty. I'm going to just go up and that's the next thing, I'm just going to read up on beauty. Well, as soon as you say that, I'm going to read up on beauty. Well, I mean, obviously, then you see it everywhere. And then you also see like, oh my God, has anybody written, like, I don't think there's any subject in the world that's maybe love, beauty, love, have been written about as much. Okay, so beauty. Right, so as soon as you say you're gonna read about beauty, you find it everywhere. I was, at the time, I was in the middle of reading 2 books. I was reading a book of poetry by Victoria Chang called With My Back to the World. And I was reading Annie Dillard's classic Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, which I'd never read before. And so here, like literally the next day, I'm turning the page in Victoria Chang's book and I'm reading. I read, "For beauty is nothing but the beginning of terror." She's quoting Rilke there. "And you make a face, your teeth covered in God's vines, dirty, black." And then later she says, "I've wanted the sky all along, but my wanting was misplaced. I lift my hand into the air and feel something grabbing my wrist, but it's not the sky, it's the beauty of the sky." And then again, there are just 2 epiphanies in life. 1 is beauty, 2 is death. And then from Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, cruelty is a mystery and the waste of pain. But if we describe a world to compass these things, a world that is a long, brute game, then we bump against another mystery, the inrush of power and light, the canary that sings on the skull. Unless all ages and races of men have been deluded by the same mass hypnotist, who? There seems to be such a thing as beauty, a grace wholly gratuitous. Dillard goes on from there to talk about this. She watches this mockingbird dive from the top of a 4th-story building with its wings totally folded, and it just plummets straight to the earth, and at the last minute puts its wings out and like gracefully lands. And she just is like feeling like, if we see beauty, do we notice it? Like, is it there? And she just, anyway, she's just kind of marveling over beauty. And that reminded me of a book I'd read earlier called The Bird Way by Jennifer Ackerman. It's about birds. And she's talking about the possibility that beauty in birds evolved because birds found it beautiful, which is really lovely. Darwin was actually the first person to suggest that. And then everyone was like, no, that's, not really, can't be. But actually recently people are picking up on this idea again. And it seems to be actually very possible that in fact, birds think that other birds are beautiful. And also that including about other birds' song and plumage and actions like the plummeting of the hummingbird. You know how they do that thing and they make that little noise and they go, and so very interesting to think about how this functions in the natural world. And then I also remembered one of the story frames of Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass was that when she started her undergrad in botany, her advisor asks her, "Why do you want to study botany?" And she says, "I wanted to learn why asters and goldenrod look so beautiful together." And her advisor said, "Well, that's not science." And she goes on to talk about this. She says, "Why do they stand beside each other when they could grow alone? Why this particular pair? There are plenty of pinks and whites and blues dotting the field, so it is only happenstance. Is it only happenstance that the magnificence of purple and gold end up side by side? What is the source of this pattern? Why is the world so beautiful? It could so easily be otherwise. Flowers could be as ugly or could be ugly to us and still fulfill their own purpose, but they're not." It seemed like a good question to me, but my advisor said, "It's not science." Later, she realizes actually it is science. Purple and yellow are complementary colors, and putting them together makes them more vivid, not only to human eyes, but also to the eyes of bees. And so she says, studies have shown that growing together, both receive more pollinator visits than they would if they were growing alone. It's a testable hypothesis. It's a question of science, a question of art, and a question of beauty. So I was going to read these. Basically, what the rest of my talk is I'm sort of compiling a commonplace book in which I just put in quotes about beauty from different sources. And I was going to read them all to you, but no, I'm not going to. But I'm going to tell you, like, allude to what some of them were. One was like a New York Times review of a new book about Audre Lorde. Talks about how when she first started writing poetry, she felt like she had to make it beautiful to counter the ugliness of the world. And then she went traveling in Mexico and felt like, oh my God, the world is gorgeous. I don't have to make up beauty anymore. Beauty is there, it exists. There's a little book that I really enjoyed called Where Things Touch, Meditations on Beauty, which is just really the idea of that beauty is where things touch. It's more complicated than that. I read books by the Irish theologian John O'Donoghue. It's called just called Beauty. There's a book called The Invisible Dragon by an art critic, and this one I will read. The arguments that artists who have committed themselves to the excruciating tedium of plain honesty have against beauty come down to one simple gripe: beauty sells. And then also a text message from my painter friend, the one who said, there's nobody straight here. Beauty is so subjective, but it has been treated as if it's a universal, which bumps up against colonialist ideas of what's good and best. I think contemporary artists resist being categorized or want to trouble those ideas. Notions of beauty can seem old-fashioned, which is really interesting because I'm also interested in the old-fashionedness of Loring and Weil. Then here, this from my own thoughts. When I think of beauty, I think of things. When I think of ugliness, I think of actions. And then this is from On Beauty and Being Just by Elaine Scarry, or Scarry. Scarry? Anybody know? Anyway, she's a critic. First, beauty is sacred. Second, beauty is unprecedented. But there's also a third feature. Beauty is life-saving. A little beauty every day, the writer Hiromi Goto used to post on Twitter with a photo, an antidote, one assumes, to ugliness there and elsewhere. So Florence Weil is a sculptor, but she also wrote poems. And I spent a lot of time with her poems, and mostly I'm still like trying to read between the lines. Like, were they? Is she writing to a lover? Is it a female lover? I don't know. But actually, if I just really pay attention to what the poems say, it mostly says that I'm super depressed, but beauty saves me over and over again. She says that a lot. I'll give you a couple examples. I will not feed my soul with sorrow, not while dark trees march in naked majesty across the sunset sky, and the far land rolls blue into the mist, and tomorrow the raw, wet earth will welcome the sun. And then another goes like this. And out of agony is music born, with love broken and hopeless. What's it mean? Man turns to beauty's self for peace, and beauty answers, looking in his eyes, there is no peace, save that which time or death may bring. But one word holds, I bid you sing. So I don't have it figured out at all, but truth and beauty are going to guide me. Thanks.
I'll put you on the spot. I didn't ask whether you want to take questions. But
Oh yeah, I'm totally good for
okay,
questions.
anyone have any questions? I got one.
Okay.
I'll kick it off
Yeah.
because like you were talking about how George R. R. Martin sort of changed the way people go about doing things. And I was thinking about the ending to Curiosities. I was thinking about you talking about the two sculptors who lived on different floors. And I was thinking about, how artists try to like clarify and amend the truth, you know, like, is there?
Oh, I like that.
Like, you know, like, and I hear a lot of stories from people who come from sort of marginalized communities,
Yeah,
and it's said that, you know, our stories are always tend to be tragic and sad, you
right,
know,
yeah.
and I did not find the ending of Curiosity to be like that. And I was wondering whether you could speak to whether that, you know, that was an intention of yours when you were rewriting, writing Curiosities.
Totally, it was. It was part of why I wanted to resist some of the, you know, I had ambitions for this novel. I wanted it to be with a big publisher, and it is, so I'm gratified. That's really nice. But I felt I went through a lot of times where I was like, oh, how do I make it the kind of novel that a big publisher is gonna take? Which it's kind of abhorrent that to be thinking that way. And so whenever I thought that, I tried to shoo that thought away. But it kept coming back, and I had to resist it because I felt like it felt truer to write a happier story in a lot of ways, than and easier to write a more tragic one, especially, you know, witches and stuff. Yeah.
And that was absolutely beautiful. Thank you. I was struck thinking about Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn, right? It's the urn that speaks those lines about truth and beauty.
Uh-huh.
And so I'm interested to kind of think about what you would say about the beautiful nature of art and the
Yeah.
truth it tells in the world that has nothing to do with the desires and designs of the artist, and what your experience of that has been, because art speaks, right? It tells me a truth that maybe an artist never intended.
Totally. I don't know that I have anything like super insightful to say about that, except that I really relate to that. Like when I go to an art gallery, I feel like often I feel like this incredible energy and this sense of elation, even if I'm encountering very difficult, dark artwork. And so it's interesting. It was really interesting to me, and I haven't read deeply into like art criticism and ideas about beauty, but it was really interesting to me that the first thing I encountered in art criticism was like, no, beauty is like the no-go zone. Like you don't say that. You don't say that you're trying to make something beautiful, but and yet we find it beautiful. And isn't that, I don't know, like the thing about the idea of other animals finding things beautiful feels like, okay, there feels something important across species about beauty, like it matters to all of us, to all creatures on some level or another. Yeah.
I have a question from the Zoom room.
Fantastic.
Okay. Do you think artists or writers create for others to experience beauty? And if so, why do you think we want others to experience beauty? Second part, do you think that's a driving motive in you and other artists? Ellipsis, and why might that be?
I mean, I think, like I quoted Hiromi Goto using the tagline, "A little beauty every day," and I feel like I experience beauty every day. I do every single day. There's something beautiful that I notice, and so it kind of feels like if that's a part of something that I experience every day, and a lot of other, like I'm watching a lot of people who are not in their heads. And like, if a lot of people feel like that they experience beauty every day, then it has to be part of, you know, the story of our stories, of our lives, of like, and I think, but I don't necessarily set out to do that. I think I set out with other motives in mind. And then I think I try to make the sentences rhythm aesthetically pleasing, which is not necessarily the same thing as beautiful. But also it's a part of, for me, of making a scene come alive is the scene has to be alive in language as well as alive in like its characters and setting and all that kind of stuff. And so I don't really think about beauty at all when I'm doing that, but I am thinking about aesthetics.
about the relationship between truth and beauty.
Yeah,
And I often find what is perceived to be beautiful is our moments of recognized truth, which even brings in that idea of the jolie LED, you know,
Right.
so ugly, it's beautiful.
right.
And there's something around that touchstone of belonging.
Oh, How do you mean?
In the moment of recognizing truth, like if I recognize the truth in what you're writing, or
oh,
then
I
we-
see.
we belong to the same
Oh.
world.
Right,
We-
which
we
is kind of
both
what Salman
recognize-
Rushdie says in his
Yeah.
little quote there. Yeah, yeah,
And that there's a feeling of beauty.
yeah. Oh, I like
in
that.
the belonging,
Right.
which is aligned to me with truth, so.
That's really interesting. I kept thinking about the truth and beauty thing and like, I was sort of feeling like this talk has failed because I haven't said how truth and beauty are linked or whatever, but because one of the things I keep bumping up against is that, a lot of truths are super ugly.
Yeah,
And so how does that fit? And I don't have an answer for that at all. Yeah,
I have a similar, I guess not really a question, but statement.
Yeah.
Something to springboard off of. I really like your gender, that you brought gender into it. Thanks for sharing all of that. It certainly speaks to me. One of the things about gender that I find, you know, the fiction of gender, we live in, gender changes. You don't wear the same clothes as you did 100 years ago, so it's all fiction. We just categorize these binaries. I find that also fascinating. Not allowed to wear this, I'm supposed to wear that. And that speaks to kind of beauty, right? Sometimes I want to wear something. I was supposed to wear a dress today. I told my husband I was going to wear a dress today, and I couldn't leave the house in a dress today because I didn't want people to perceive me as ugly. I didn't want to have to. There's something around gender expression and being your best self
right.
that speaks to, that makes me think about beauty.
Yeah,
And, you know, sitting here with you talking, it made me think about, well, when we find something beautiful, the beauty of the thing that we see is a mirror. It is teaching us what we know and love about the world. And it's a kind of recognition.
mhm,
We see ourselves, we know more of ourselves by the things we are attracted to, and we know more of ourselves from the things that we reject. So an ugly truth can still be very beautiful to us because it teaches us
right.
what we do not want,
Yeah,
what we wish were otherwise.
yeah,
And so I'm interested in the ideas in your story, this idea of fiction. Maybe one of the bridges between truth and beauty is how our passions reveal to ourselves what we hold most precious.
yeah, what our truths are.
They teach us
Yeah.
who we are.
Oh, I like that a lot. Yeah. That resonates for
Okay,
me.
so if I'm going to ask a question.
Yeah, okay.
It not sound like I'm, you know, trying to
Just-
pontificate. Do you think maybe write the things that you write and things you're fascinated with, that this is what compels you, is that you find out more of who you are? Are you looking for truth and beauty in the things you make because they educate? You self-educate?
I would never have said that about myself, so I don't think so.
Hmm.
But I really like the ideas that you're talking about. And I think they shape my sense of what's beautiful. I think they shape my sense of what's true for myself. So I think they do function in the way that you're talking about, but I'm not sure that I apply it to fiction yet. I don't know. Yeah.
Maybe another way to phrase it is, if you're writing work that you think is a kind of truth, is that something that is a statement that you already know? Was there a curiosity?
Oh, about discovery.
Yeah. I'm just-
Yeah, yeah. I suspect if I think I'm not that conscious of those things operating while I'm writing, but I think that, you know, part of that probing and deciding what's the next scene And what happens for these people is it's a creation and wondering, and a creation and a wondering, and it's like a rolling thing that that starts with uncertainty and then grows into something else, and then gets cycled back over with a little bit of greater certainty and moves forward into uncertainty and the unknown and the learning. So in that sense, yeah, I do think that's true. Mhm.
Another one from our audience on Zoom. Curious if you have come across the mention of symmetry very often in your research so far on beauty.
Yes, I definitely have. It's mentioned frequently, both ideas about like symmetry being a significant aspect of our many formulations of beauty, but also that perfect symmetry is often seen as not beautiful. So it's like this, it needs to have imperfection in order to be truly beautiful. Yeah.
One more.
Okay.
The question is, how do you manage the terror of infringing on the truth of someone's life
Yeah.
with your own fiction?
Yeah, I don't. This is literally going to be the biggest hurdle in working on this next book, is how do I leap this barrier? How do I, and it feels important to me. And I'm tempted to do the same thing that I did with Curiosities, like create this Anne character who's like trying out one story and then trying out, and like, oh, come on, I don't truly want to do the same thing, but I am trying to figure out what are alternate structures that I could use to frame this fiction that would let me to tell multiple stories. And one of the things I've started to do also is look beyond Loring and Weil. So while I've been doing this research, I've also discovered all these other amazing women sculptors born in the 1880s. There are these, and there are these 3 American sculptors who, there's this video online from I don't like 26 or 32, it's like home movies. This wealthy American sculptor named Cornelia Chapin had this property in upstate New York that was like this little like lesbian artist utopia, where they went and hung out, and they sculpt, and then they compost, and then they eat breakfast, and they go horseback riding, and then they sculpt, and then and so I'm wondering, and there's more documentation to show that though Cornelia Chapin did have significant affairs with women. And Loring and Weil's friends in Toronto were a veterinarian and a medical doctor, another couple of women whose letters are in the archives at U of T, and they're very explicit about being in love with each other, and they call kisses stars, and they're like, I give you 1,000 stars and stuff like that. So there are these other people that might be a way for me to get into it. So I'm trying to figure out by what mechanism can I get over my issue with not wanting to falsely represent these people. That kind of seems like a good one to end on, eh?
That's a great,
Yeah, thanks, everybody.
I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank Anne again. I'd like to thank Sharon Thesen for being an inspiration for this great lecture series. I'd like to thank Matt Rader for inviting me to speak in front of you, Shauna and Paige and Vanessa, so many people, and I've forgotten. Very sorry, Dania, great people here, and we get to celebrate with some wine and some nibbles, and that's all great. And hopefully we can get to chat more. Thank you so much,
Sounds great.
Anne.
Thank
Yeah.
you.